The subject of sexual assault, misconduct, and harassment is a lightning rod issue at National Defence.
It's a stunning statistic. Every day, 5 people in the Canadian military are
Deschamps
sexually
found the military
assaulted.
possessed a sexualized culture in which harassment and assault were underreported and often
The Canadian
overlooked.
Forces has an undeniable problem of sexual harassment and sexual assault, and it has to change.
It was sort of out of the blue, but sort of not out of the blue, how this all started. I had originally done a cover story on living conditions in the military. I did that story one week. It got a tremendous response from the public and also from the military. And I got one call one day, and it was a guy who told me he was military, still active military, and he was just ranting and raving about how disgusted he was by the men in the military who were complaining about their living conditions. I don't know what happened to him or what question I asked, but he started confessing to me. And he said, I am so ashamed of so many things I've done. At which point he began to tell me he was systematically sexually assaulting the cadets that would come in for, their basic training.
The military gendered culture, of course, is a male-dominated institution. It's an institution where hypermasculinity is still celebrated. The ideal soldier is often still associated with the combat warrior. And so this is a culture in which women have often had to prove themselves. They've had to work very hard to fit in.
We go back to the 1990s with gender integration. First thing that comes out is 1989 is the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling that the armed forces has to change and they have to integrate women more into the armed forces. They're very slow in implementing change, and the Human Rights Tribunal gives them 10 years. 1998, 1 year before the Human Rights Tribunal is going to come back and check and see if their numbers are up, and they aren't. There's the rape crisis.
There's no question that these women were traumatized by what happened. Once you're in the military system with, the code of silence, the chain of command, all these rules and regulations, you give up a lot of your freedoms when you go in there. And so these women were traumatized also by that, not only by being assaulted, but by the injustice of what happened to them after they were assaulted.
So I went up and I joined and I did all the testing and everything, and I thought I was getting excited about it because being on my own too and not really feeling like I belonged anywhere ever, it was like I was going to be a part of something bigger. I wanted to be a medical assistant, and they said that it was kind of full, so they said if I took my second choice I would go right away. So I became a naval signalman. They told me that I could remuster in a few years, and then I figured I could take night classes, and when I was ashore I could go to college, university, and build enough credits. If I could prove that I could get into medical school, the military would pay for it, and then I would just do time in return. So even though I had some problems in basic training, I met some amazing people, and you become a family and you start to do things together. I think in my platoon there was 102 people or something, and 25 girls. In the end, you would do anything to help that person next to you get through. And it was all of a sudden, you had brothers and sisters that would do anything for you.
That you're part of a family, and you go into battle together, and you have to have one another's backs, and there has to be all this trust and everything. So it's an extra level of trust. All those things set up in the culture to trust your fellow soldier, and then your fellow soldier rapes you.
They had kept me all night, and when I left in the morning, I went back to my room, and I had someone who they told everything come down, and he took me out for coffee to try to talk to me, but I was in so much pain. I had no choice but to go to the hospital, and I was bleeding and everything, so he went and found my roommate, and she took me. And then they gave me the options. We can just let this go, or we can call the military police, but if you want a rape kit done, we have to call the military police, and they have to be involved. You don't necessarily have to charge them, but we have to involve them. And I was like, well, I want proof because I know what they did to me was wrong. They told me that they had talked to the Crown and stuff, and that because there was 2 of them, 1 of me, and their stories matched and mine didn't, that nothing could proceed unless I wanted to go through hell.
As we've all learned from the Me Too movement, women are not necessarily believed, even if they've got the most rock-solid case in the world. There were military policemen who were men, and they were, complaining how corrupt the system was, especially if there was a power imbalance, if, it was a woman private who was sexually assaulted against somebody of higher rank. The whole ranking thing is so problematic in the military. So there were many, many men that came forward and said, the system really stinks, and this did happen to these women, and it was tragic.
The military represents a very hierarchical institution, and it is often the case across military and civilian institutions that workplaces that have a lot of hierarchy tend to have more abusive power.
I only ended up doing about 14 days of my confinement because I ended up in the hospital. I had to stand beside the guy every hour on the hour in front of the whole fleet school that lived in our building because we had duty and duty watch, and they would all form up, and I had to stand there and say I was guilty. I got called in by my chief and told that it didn't happen because when I didn't charge them, because there was no formal charges, it didn't happen. And then he told me that because I was an ordinary seaman, I was nobody. And I was nothing, and I would never amount to anything, and it was his Navy.
So then she was moved down to another base, and of course the minute they got on the base, she got on the base, there were cat calls and everything else. They said, we know who you are and don't pull that stuff here. She couldn't even escape it, so she got no justice whatsoever. She got humiliated, she got injustice, and she got essentially driven crazy. And they were just forcing her out of the military.
This whole idea of facing reprisals at work, you're kind of breaking the ranks, the unity. So when you're talking, people won't necessarily congratulate you for speaking out. They're most likely going to go with the person that was accused first. This kind of a reflex to self-preserve, self-protection. So it's a lonely place to be reporting.
I was told that someone had called and told all about me. I got blamed for having gallstones that I had to get out, and I was like, did I swallow sand? Like, I don't know how they got in there, right? And then I got infection after infection. I developed an eating disorder. I got sick again, and they just posted me ashore. So I was off the Gatineau, and I ended up in the psych ward.
So we have seen an increase in reporting on sexual harassment and sexual assault. That is positive, but we also need to keep in mind that reporting can often be detrimental for the person doing the reporting. So anecdotally, we know that a lot of survivors of military sexual trauma who report end up medically releasing. So reporting often equals a loss of employment, and that is a huge problem.
I have the definition on my website, but I took it from the VA, which is the Veterans Affairs American website. And it's military sexual trauma, or MST, is the term used by the Department of Veterans Affairs, VA, to refer to experience of sexual assaults or repeated threatening sexual harassment that a veteran experienced during his or her military service.
I didn't even want out of the military, really. Like, my family had come to visit. I was still in the psych ward. I had got to stay home for a week with them. Come back to the psych ward, and I think I couldn't find my sock or something, and I was like, I don't want to be here anymore. But I wanted to die, because like I was going through so much and I couldn't understand. They wouldn't let me go back to work at a safe place, and they're like, okay, well, you're already like a medical burden. So within a week I was out on a bus home with all that Prozac, feeling like the worst failure in the world, because they wouldn't remuster me, they wouldn't look after me, they wouldn't put me in a civilian hospital to get me better.
With medical releases, of course, there is often, for the person undergoing the medical release, a sense of failure, of not having been able to live up to the ideal of the stoic soldier. So medical releases can be difficult in that sense, because they may also lead to a sense of loss of identity, a sense of not quite being worthy.
If you put your head in that, those set of conditions, and you think of yourself in a world where there's a few people that have got power over you and you have no power, and they then have the power to literally drive you crazy. It's like a science fiction movie that those girls ended up in. So I'm sure they were traumatized. They weren't given any, not only treatment, therapy in there. So they had to wait to be sort of kicked out of the military, driven out in these insane ways they drive people out, like giving them weird duties to do and all this stuff that's just horrible. They're completely shattered. They would have no confidence whatsoever, and just the humiliation of it all, and that nobody was there to listen to your story or take your story seriously.
Women, as equal members of this society, should have equal opportunities to participate in our key state institutions. There's no question about that. It should be their right, and it's the military's responsibility to create an environment in which women can work in the military without having to fear the gendered and sexualized culture.
And every doctor I've ever seen has always said that if I was just assaulted, I would have been able to move on. I would have been able to handle it. But it was the secondary re-victimization over and over again, having to live with them, having him in a room across from me on the confinement, having to see him, having to go somewhere else, and everyone knowing my story all the time. That's the stuff that destroyed me.
You can't crack through that military as an outsider. We had to wait till women, were assaulted, got out of the military, had their lives destroyed, but then we could bring their story to light.
I'll get people saying that I did a great thing, and I'm like, well, it wasn't that great. But I also get the mixed reaction from people saying that my magazine saved them, or because of my magazine, they'll never come forward. That part hurts, because I don't understand why they wouldn't, but then I understand that they read about the repercussions that I suffered, and they don't want to come forward until they're finally out.
If not for the media, who? Who's going to do it? Nobody's going to do it. Everybody will get away with it, whatever they can get away with, which is what happened, prior to the Maclean series. They were getting away with it for years. It was, we could cover it all up, no repercussions, and they will do that again.